What is up, everybody? Welcome to How We Roll. It is Thursday, and tonight we are bringing you an episode of Dialogues and Dice. That's our little talk show where we talk about role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, and all things related. You're here with me, Gorbad, the normal DM for How We Roll, and also one of our longest time ever players, Shagget.
Hey, I'm old. You don't have to rub it in, man. Longest time.
Old. We are
geriatric old. Viewer, geriatric player. Well, hello, everybody. I got out of bed for this.
He's sitting down so he doesn't need his walker or any of that stuff.
What's up, guys? Oldest player. Right, Trunk? Rude, man.
What the funniest thing to me is the fact that I'm considerably
like
older than you.
Than me.
So if you're old, I'm decrepit. I'm older.
Hey.
I'm more old than you.
Hey, I have said time and time again recently, I'm 41 going on 65. That's how I feel, you know? Like...
Man, I understand it. That's, as we get older, we feel more and more old. Oh. Which I suppose makes sense, but you know what I mean. Like, I didn't really feel any different up into my 40s, but after that, I started to, really notice that, hey, I can't do the things I used to do.
It starts with alcohol consumption, where in your 20s you can drink so much and be okay the next day or survive.
Right.
Now, when I hit my 30s, it started where I would have half what I used to drink and wake up feeling like complete buns the next day. And yeah, it just went downhill from there.
That's it. The downhill slime. Whoa, what was that noise? That's a new one.
What is going on?
I don't know what that noise was. It's a noise I haven't heard before.
Well, I didn't hear anything, but...
Parkin Seal gifted a sub. Okay, appreciate that, Parkin. Hobbs 138, you got a gifted sub from Parkin Seal. Say thank you because it's the right thing to do. All right. Also, while we're here doing all the things, just want to say we go to. Let's see.
Oh, Prepper, thank you.
There we go. Where's the thing? The thing that I use, the stuff that I have.
Wow,
we changed to a brand new bot. We were forced to because the other one just quit working. And when we did that, some things changed. So I'm having to remind myself where everything is. So yeah, Prepper Jack, 50,000 bits. Thank you for that. Very, very kind.
Nice.
Let's see. We've got Parkinson gifted a sub, Terrapixel resub, Bloodbender resubbed, the Wrath of Shane resubbed. So thank all of you for that.
Wow. Thank you guys.
So tonight on Dialogues and Dice, we're going to dive into some interesting stuff, going all the way back to before D&D was a thing. But we're going to start it all. I want to ask you guys in chat one very simple question. And that is, and I want you guys to answer, reply, give us your answers. And here's the question. How did you learn to play Dungeons and Dragons or whatever tabletop role-playing game that you majority play? I'm guessing most of you it's Dungeons and Dragons. Some of you it may not be. But how did you learn to play D&D or the role-playing game that you play? How did you learn to play it? Prepper Jack, thanks for the resub, bud. So go ahead and give us your answers in chat. Because it kind of, this whole episode really hinges on some of that.
Just to fill the dead air while you guys actually answer, you all know how I learned how to play D&D, and it's the show. I learned how to play D&D from Gorbad and from How We Roll.
There you go. Okay, so yeah, so Shagget learned. I'm going to answer last. Shagget learned from being on the show, and basically, I guess I taught you how to play D&D, right?
Yes, although I had played a MUD role-playing game
Yeah.
prior to that, which will come into the conversation a little bit later because it's all kind of connected anyway. So I was playing role-playing games or role-playing chat rooms, which sounds naughtier than it actually is, but you know,
role-playing chat rooms, love it.
on AOL
Yep.
in the 90s, but you know.
Terrapixel said friends and watching streams plus vids plus reading the player's handbook. Okay, that's hold on to that thought. I learned to play by Rethshane says I learned to play by watching, and when I was into it by creating characters for fun. Then eventually I started playing with strangers online, but with West Marches. Okay. Cuddy Early said I kind of just dove in head first with a bunch of other new players and one experienced DM. Good deal.
Well, that's how we rolled it.
Prepperjack learned it from reading the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons manual. I got my mom to pay for the hobby store and Temple of Elemental Evil book. Found someone to DM for, think I was like 8. Okay, yep, good point, wow. Prepper. Neo said, my dad gave me his copy of the Dragonlance Chronicles to read. Fell in love with, and he taught me how to play. He has been playing since it originally came out. Okay, anybody else that hasn't answered, get your answers in. Because this whole episode is going to be very interesting to you guys, because this is kind of how we're diving into what, when, how, why, for, and such. Lamina, watch you guys, then found a group through this channel and learned from there. Awesome. Beta DM Dragon learned when a friend came over to my house with a 3.5 handbook.
Yeah!
Awesome. Okay, good deal. So, as a variety of things there. And
all of them are wrong.
No, they're all right. So, let's start by, that's our intro. So, we're going to go into our main topic, and we don't have a ton of them tonight, so we're really just going to kind of move into Let's Talk, which is our segment. Main segment tonight, Let's Talk, which is basically us discussing some things and stuff that are D&D and tabletop role-playing game related.
Let's Talk.
Brother Shane said, I guess you can say I taught, How We Roll taught me because you were one of the first content creators I got into. Gotcha. Neo said, we actually had the AD&D first edition books in our school library. It was easy to find other people to play out by looking. Okay, oh, a hype chest. Whoop, whoop. There we go, hype chest, thank you. Alright. So, let's go ahead and I've got a bunch of things for you guys tonight. Alright, so how D&D grew, how D&D changed, tabletop role-playing game evolution, and quite honestly, people asking the simple question, how the fuck do you play this game? So, we're going to kind of delve into that. So, Dungeons & Dragons, as most of you probably know, famously resulted from the intersection of two individual gaming cultures, right? The gaming culture of conflict simulation, which was kind of like tabletop miniature-based war games, and literary cultural engagement, such as fantasy and science fiction. Or as Gary Gygax put it back in 1976, it arose from a combination of warfare with miniature figures and the desire to create heroic epics of the strange and supernatural. Well, in the early days, gamers communicated through national and regional clubs. Bear in mind, there was no internet. There was no social media. So there certainly was no virtual tabletop, right? There was no Discord for you to find other groups with. If you played a role-playing game back in the day, you played it around a table with real human beings.
In front of them.
In front of them, like as a group, right?
Scary, I know, but yeah.
So these regional and national clubs hosted both large and local, arguably micro conventions. And a lot of them published amateur magazines or fanzines, which were there to disseminate the ideas throughout their membership. So some of these zines, basically, you signed up, they printed on a typewriter and a photocopier as many editions or episodes or whatever as they needed to get out to their subscriber base. So if there were 86 subscribers, they made 86 of them and handed them to you, or maybe mailed them to you, right? That was how you got your info. That is how you connected with your hobby, with your game. Now, as war games and fantasy fiction fanzines, they kind of started circulating as early as the 1950s, believe it or not, because we all think about this hobby that we love kind of being created in the early 1970s, but the hobby itself supersedes that. It just never became what we know it to be until mid-1970s, and in many ways past that. So as the War Games and Fantasy Fictions magazine started circulating, it began to grow because J.R.R. Tolkien and stuff like that was out and published, and people were reading these works and enjoying them. And by the 1960s, we saw things like The Lord of the Rings and, the books, and the Star Trek TV show bring a new influx of readers and enthusiasts into science fiction and fantasy. Which also means more people wanted to absorb these fanzines. So, at this point, many of the fanzines were experimenting in cross-platform talk. So they were discussing war games, but they realized that a lot of people that like war games also like fantasy, also like science fiction. So some of them started to say, well, this fanzine, it's for all things fantasy, it's all things sci-fi, it's all things war game. And this experiment led to the publication of Gygax's fantasy medieval war game rules, which was Chainmail, which he first brought out in 1971. Which in turn triggered the collaboration between him and Dave Arneson of what ultimately became Dungeons and Dragons. Now, believe it or not, at this time, there was an estimated 100,000 people playing war games. All I hear is Gore talking about how old he is. Well, I don't go back to the 1960s or the 50s, but 70s, yeah, I'm there. But yeah, so at this time, there's about 100,000 players of war games. Most war gamers were also fantasy and sci-fi readers as well. And it was this understanding that led Gary Gygax to ultimately create his publishing company, TSR, or Tactical Studies Rules. Now, it has way more to do with wargaming at this point than what we now consider to be Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, when TSR first came around, Dungeons & Dragons wasn't a thing. Not even close to being a thing.
Didn't they do like actual war game simulations with actual units and like worlds?
Yes,
modern day war gaming. Basically?
Absolutely, and that's kind of where we're segueing.
Right.
So,
cool.
In the day, the fanzine was the main medium, as we've said, in which fans could share their ideas. They weren't published, they weren't edited. Rather, as a fan, you wrote in an article. You wrote an article and you mailed it into the zine. And basically, they would print that article as is in the zine and invite people to comment on the article. Almost like a modern-day Reddit or a modern-day bulletin board or chat, but in print. The posterity might be tempted to suppose that the initial interpretation of Dungeons & Dragons rigidly followed the simulation-driven precepts of wargaming, and that only later there was a shift to what we might pinpoint at some point in history to becoming a faction of that particular community that adopted a practice that focused more on stories and characters rather than units on a battlefield. Now, back then, amongst these miniature wargame players, there existed a long tradition of referees who not only arbitrated disputes, but also managed the execution of the wargame system. A practice, believe it or not, that dates back to the Prussian Kriegspiel. Now, Kriegspiel was a very early, and it's right there, there's an image of it, right below me, of units on a battlefield. And this goes back to the early 19th century. Now, the system basically was called Riestwitz, which is Prussian for a thing that I don't know. But it was developed in the 1820s. And at that time, there was an evolution of how games were played. Players no longer moved pieces on a board, but instead wrote down their orders just as if they would to subordinates during actual wartime. And the referee, in somewhat constellation of the basic rules that they had, and sometimes dice rolls, would determine the outcome. Now, the whole point of the fact that this is a game that had a referee is very important. Now, if you kind of think back to typical board games and games that we played, you didn't have referees. You don't need referees because you have definitive rules. And we're going to elaborate a little bit more on that as we go down this concept and this discussion. But the game Riestwitz intended the game as a teaching tool that would instruct real-world officers in the science of command, teaching them how to draft written orders. And so the authority of the referee in these games resembled the authority of a teacher over a classroom, right? Because you weren't just being a person that made arbitrary decisions utilizing the rules, but you had to kind of interpret these rules and then discuss an outcome. So by having the referee respond to players' orders with only limited intelligence that a wartime commander might have, Reitzwald hoped his game would instill in a player the same sort of uncertainty over the results as they would have in the actual field of battle. So later it was deemed that having strict rules made things dull. They made things unrealistic and overly complicated. So the referee was then given the broad discretion to determine outcomes. And that is the very ideal that led to game masters or dungeon masters. Residing over the table, but not just refereeing a set of confined rules, they were arbitrating the result using judgment that they themselves had and the ability to interpret the rules as needed, making those things basically more guidelines than rules. Now, one important recorded dialogue during a game in 1966 in Modern War in Miniatures became very relevant to the future development of how D&D was played. You see, the referee, or judges, of a gentleman called Korn, he had war games. And he basically said, we're the only one who needs to know, or we're the only ones who needs to know the rules and be familiar with them. The players only need to give orders as they would in actual combat. But orders, in this case, included verbalizing dialogue between the referees and the players. He gave an example where the player, a German soldier, says to the referee, hears from the referee, "The American is on your left about 12 meters away, running at you with his bayonet." The player famously asks, "Can I still move?" The referee replies, "Sure, but you're almost unconscious." The player then declares his intention, "I'm turning around and firing the rest of my Schmeisser's clip into him." The immediacy of this first-person dialogue created a far more dramatic pace than the traditional Kriegspiel conducted through just written orders that were passed to and from the Game Master. So prior to this, the player would write down what he wanted to do, hand it to the Game Master, or referee. The referee would move the pieces and then say, "This is what happened." There was no actual dialogue discussed. But in this particular incident, a dialogue struck up between the referee and the individual player. So you can already kind of see how that's far more related to how we understand Dungeons and Dragons today. And it was deemed important that referees kept maps and information about the state of the game secret from the players. Because, much like in a real wartime situation, you would not know where the enemy troops are planning to move. You would not know what resources they had. So, he only allowed them to know what was happening in the immediate vicinity and the confines of knowledge possessed by the player's troops or commanders at that time. Now, in Korn's books, he didn't clutter everything with rules, but rather tables so that they could be used to simulate probability and outcome. And he wrote, "There is only one rule in our game, and that is to simulate reality. While the tables and charts are designed to help with the simulation, when they get in the way, you should discard them." Sound familiar? Okay, we've all heard people talking about in Dungeons and Dragons, the rules are just suggestions, guidelines, and it's honestly expected for the DM or Game Master to circumnavigate those whenever it makes sense to do so. So, when you kind of think about that, it really prompts you to kind of have an understanding of where we got to, where we came from and where we are. So to simplify what Korn meant, in his one rule, it simply implied a referee be ready to improvise any rule or any situation on the spot in favor of what seemed right, not what a particular written rule specified. The understanding that in a real wartime battle, it's impossible to dictate every outcome, and thus have an order written to how to react to it. So it's paramount in the development of Dungeons and Dragons that the understanding is you have to learn to adapt. And that is kind of what led to how Dungeons and Dragons was perceived to be played. Now, in evolution, its evolution was based on two groups, as we said, wargamers and story people. It was ultimately the merging of these two groups that led to the creation of D&D and ultimately the role-playing game. So D&D inherited the plastic approach of systems and miniature games, right? The original rules insisted that, as with other sets of miniature rules, they are merely guidelines to follow in designation of your own fantastic medieval campaigns, explicitly granting referees the power to change the system to suit their own tabletop. And this language echoes what one could already read in Gygax's chainmail 3 years later, or earlier, and that was, these rules may be treated as guidelines around which you form a game that suits you and your players. Language that effectively charged the readers to become game designers at that very point. Gygax would elaborate in an article months later in the Chainmail booklet. Many unusual circumstances are not covered in these rules, as they are meant primarily as guidelines. The rules are purposely vague in areas in order to encourage thinking and initiative on the part of the players or contestants. So, from a very early stage, we understand that while there are rules on how to play this game, they weren't really rules. They were more a bunch of tables and charts and suggestions and simple guidelines on how to achieve certain things in order to play this game. So the authors of D&D took their own advice on this matter, and already in mid-1975, Gygax could write that Dave, this is Dave Arneson, and I disagree on how to handle any number of things, and both of our campaigns differ from the rules found in D&D. In other words, we don't even follow our own rules that we wrote. Because we put these rules down as guidelines for other people, but we've already realized, yeah, we don't like this. We're going to change this. And they both did it in different ways. He said, I don't believe there is anything desirable in having various campaigns playing similar to one another. And if the time ever comes when players agree on how the game should be played, D&D will have become stained and boring indeed. Gygax explicitly encouraged others to innovate, urging, if you don't like the things the way we tell you to do them, change the bloody rules to suit yourself and your players. This latitude naturally inspired experiments that led to the development and specifications of variants, and ultimately in the release of competing commercial products, a consequence of the game's surprising success that Gygax apparently did not foresee. So, when you think about war games, as you can see below, war games it was very common for people to have a massive map, and they would measure and make notes and use protractors and things to calculate angles and all that sort of stuff. And they were playing these war games, early on from like Napoleonics, where you'd have units lined up across in front of each other, and then they'd all roll dice to see how many units you shot and killed this turn, right? And then that progressed into World War II games, where they had tanks and artillery and things like that on the battlefield. But that's where it all started. But eventually we was going to come away from units. We were going to come away from tanks. We're going to come away from cavalry. And we were going to start focusing on the individual. So this was where things kind of started to make a monumental shift. The wargamers quickly recognized that Dungeons & Dragons didn't fit the usual mold. Though many still initially received it within the competitive traditions of wargames, qualifying it, if not rejecting it, they realized the putative neutrality being necessary in the referee. Now, over time, however, this was seen to be clearly problematic, and people looked for an alternative way to play. They realized, through actual attempts to play, what Korn had already surmised: you can't play a game like this and stick to a rigid set of rules. In fact, one of the biggest differences with Dungeons & Dragons was players' actions could go far beyond the scope of any wartime commander, and in fact a player could conceivably attempt any action that could be done in the real world. Anything the referee could describe verbally could become an action. and anything a player could articulate as a statement of intention could potentially translate into an action. So rules at that time started to become a struggle, because you couldn't have a rule for everything. Back in the day, an average rulebook or pamphlet or something might be 50 to 100 pages. Well, imagine the volume that you would need to write enough rules to basically encompass every possible scenario. And very quickly they realized it can't be done.
Possible.
Right. So it took a while for the games to incorporate rules language explaining how dialogue should even work. Like suggesting the referee start a game by kicking off the dialogue. You should tell them where they are to begin with. And from then on, the players should tell you what they want to do and tell them the results of their actions using dice, charts, and tables to help determine these results. A player's ability to know what to say and how to say it was how a player's skill was judged, while a canny referee knew how to handle the player's statements of intent and how to interpret it. A player being too vague could lead to ruin, while a detailed description of intent could be met with reward. No one thing exemplified this more than the wish spell. In fact, where it was implied and intended that the referee should manipulate a poorly worded wish to yield a negative result, and thus punish the player who articulated the intent poorly. Unless the wish was deemed to be selfless. So when we think about a card game or a board game, we have a set of rules. And it is expected that everybody plays according to those rules. Sure, a few games adopt house rules. Like in Monopoly, some people say, oh, well, if you land on free parking, it's generally assumed that you pick up all the fines. And all the fines are put in the middle. And if you land on free parking, you get those fines. That's not written in the rules, but a lot of people adopted that rule. Who come up with it first.
Isn't it true that Monopoly is widely regarded as the board game with the most house rules that have mistakenly been seen as actual rules, but they're actually house rules that just became massively popular?
Yeah, because most people don't ever read the rules of Monopoly. They learn to play by other people, and they
rules from the house rules. Yeah,
right. No, exactly right. So, because of that concept that we're all going to adhere to these rules, a referee is unnecessary. You don't need a referee. You don't have a referee when you play Monopoly. You all play. And the rules are the referee. But when you play a game that cannot possibly have the rules cover every allowable action, the referee becomes necessary. The thing is, in the early days, no one realized the referee would have to do a lot more than just arbitrate the rules of the outcome of the game. So, the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons meant we're no longer going to concentrate on units. We're no longer going to concentrate on tanks, cavalry, as we've said. We are now concentrating on individuals. And the crossover element was where war games were based on reality. Let's take the concept of a war game and apply it to science fiction, or in Dungeons & Dragons' case, fantasy. And you become an individual, fantastical hero. So,
and it's funny because the number one question we got on our YouTube channel was always the episode of Children of Jakar where we did a war simulation with multiple units.
Right.
That was the number one question: is how do you manage a massive battle in D&D? When that should be the most known part of it because of its history.
Right, but it's the
how
most
far it
forgotten part of it.
deviated and changed. Yeah, it's no longer the case anymore. It's interesting.
That's it. No, exactly.
That was the number one question you got fielded. Like, what did you do? What was the rules?
Yeah, how did you make this happen? And honestly, it was an incredibly simplistic, loose rule set, because I knew if I tried to turn this into a war game, this episode will take months.
I mean, it was already a 7-hour on the stream.
Oh, it was incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, in short, the makers of the game realized they really had not defined a set way to play, and were content to figure that part out on their own. So, the original old school D&D, which was the first set of rules, which is right below me here, next to the copy of Chainmail, which is kind of arguably where they grew from, was just a series of 4 pamphlets. They were very small, very thin, and mostly were full of charts and tables, told you how to roll up a character, gave you guidelines as to what characters you could be: elf, dwarf, fighter, wizard, cleric, right? But that was kind of it. And this is the strange thing, and this is why I asked all of you at the very beginning, how did you learn to play? So, unless you learned to play and copied or adopted the method of a game master you played under, you almost certainly played the game totally different than anybody else around you. If you acquired the game and then attempted to learn how to play, you would almost certainly make your own interpretation and method of play, to where if 2 groups met and were playing the game, both would think that each group was playing an entirely different game all together. If you were a wargamer, you inherently focused on the combat and resolution of combat, whereas the story people were more interested in the collaboration and the efforts of the players. As such, the wargamers' referees usually was dealing with conflict with the players, and was directly adversarial against them. So, around this table that started off as wargamers, the referee was giving you scenarios and trying to defeat you. Which, as we now believe, not how you play Dungeons and Dragons. These people didn't know any better, because nowhere were they told how to play. They were just saying, here's a bunch of things and rules and charts, use these and play your game. So that was kind of an interesting thing. You know, that referee is trying to defeat the players, whereas in the other camp, the referee was more trying to just challenge the players. Referees typically addressed the party in the second person, while players generally spoke in the first person. The original rules offered an example of play, but it looked like something the designers apparently found so obvious that it went without saying. As there was no intent to elaborate beyond that, there was no internet, there was no social media. So, the concept of a game playing in turns led to some people trying to play the game by mail. And play by mail become a thing. Where a game master would publish, much like a zine, an initial intent, and then every player would get a form and they'd write down what they did in their turn, where they described their actions and then mailed it to the GM, who would collate all these results and then reply by mail with the outcome, and then you would take your next turn, and so on and so forth. Which meant it typically took a week to 2 weeks per turn to occur. Now, D&D, however, was designed to be played around a table in person, and with a referee, or the now coined title, Dungeon Master, and a group of players. So, things are very different, right? Gygax stressed that a good DM would temper their own particular wishes with the tastes of the players, but also that he saw something like a competition being at play. As the players learned of the creation and began to seek to outwit the DM then should further his efforts to challenge the player. Gygax did not envision this as a purely adversarial game, but more one where the DM was there to challenge the skill of the players. Now again, What do we consider skill of the players? Well, as we said, the skill was determined on your ability to describe your actions and come up with innovative things to do. So also, much like in the Prussian war game that was used to train real officers, the DM kept his dice rolls hidden, so that the players were not privy to what their characters could not know. In fact, this is where combating the metagame began. That being said, early versions of D&D never really explained who should roll the dice, and at some tables, the Dungeon Master rolled all the dice, and the players only described their actions. Of course, it was meant for players to roll the dice for their characters' actions so as to create a sense of immediate involvement and sense of responsibility for the player. Whereas, if you basically said, I search for traps, the DM would roll the dice behind the table and say, you find nothing. Oh, I proceed. Ha-ha! The floor gives way and you fall 50 feet onto a bunch of spikes. That was a way some people played. That was how it worked. But again, not all people. Now, with the concept of player skill, and that the skill can be measured, in 1975, at the first Origins convention, they ran the famous Tome of Horrors tournament. 15 players were judged on their skill to play by their ability to detail out their actions and their ingenuity, and were limited in time that they had to come up with and describe these actions. Some homebrew tables allow players endless time to come up with the desired actions, while others maintain a more realistic demand on expecting actions to be described quickly, and understanding that the monsters would not simply hold their actions midway while the players discussed a strategy. The later was more in line with what was intended, or it was what was the original intent. Now, this is where the roleplay and in-character focus began to take on more of a role. You could not take 20 minutes to describe what your character was going to do in 6 seconds. So you had to act as the character in real time. This was no longer you playing a game where you sat around the table, discussed what you were going to do on your turn, plotted it out, played out your turn. Now, you had to be the character. Now you had to say, this is what my character does, and you had to do it quickly. You had to respond. Initially, the game designers never employed the term roleplay, or role-playing, as we have come to know it. It wasn't until 1975 when a man named George Phillips mentioned in an article that the appeal of D&D might rest in its fulfillment of allowing a player to take on a role or role-playing. Gygax actually rebuked that claim, instead saying it was more due to the appeal of constant challenge. That's why people like this game. Well, the term roleplay began to catch on, but the consensus on what it meant was not apparent. Now, as TSR began to face competition in the gaming industry, these companies began to use the term role-playing to give themselves a likening to D&D without running into legal issues. Adventure games was almost the term that became the standard, but it lacked the emphasis on what made these games unique. Now, in 75 to 76, the publishers of Tunnels and Trolls, which was a D&D-esque type game, first paved that path in its advertisements. Before the year was out, TSR itself put role-playing game on the cover of its games and adopted the term. In 1977, let's see here, with basic Dungeons and Dragons, which was, what's up, clan? The game was divided into 5 box sets. You had basic, and then it went through advanced and immortal, and each box set covered a few levels. The initial intent was to not overwhelm you with rules, because as we've already discussed, there's too many rules.
Bullshit! They just wanted to make more money.
And that's
Bullshit.
exactly it. But
this only covers 1 to 3. You need to buy this other box set.
if you want to be 4 to 6 and 7 to 9, right? No, and that's exactly right. But they figured out a better way.
Of course.
But it was when this particular version, Holmes Basic D&D, came out, it identified itself as rules for fantasy, medieval, role-playing, adventure game campaigns. And this being said, role-playing game was still a very loose term that people still had not reached a consensus of what it actually meant. Even though these types of games now had a genre, people still struggled to isolate the role-playing element of these games. I think it was the adoption of speaking in the first person that really began to help the term gain understanding. Because saying, last night I killed a dragon, made it far more of a personal connection than saying, in the game we played, my character killed a dragon. And it was part of the understanding of the genre's success that the connection between player and character was fundamental to his experience and rising popularity. Now, the statistics and attributes of the game helped shape the role. And for D&D, the alignment was there to help shape parameters for the character's attitude, morality, and personality. Now, in the fanzines of that time, there were many arguments about what role-playing meant, as well as the continuation of the argument as to how, in fact, to play Dungeons & Dragons. For example, one such argument argued on the subject of intelligence. One camp insisted that the player's intelligence was at play, as it was the player's skill that mattered, and the intelligence attribute was merely for mechanical purposes, while another camp argued that you were playing the role of the character. So your choices should strive to emulate the intelligence level of that character. Discussions and things said between players were differentiated from discussions that were said as characters. This in part led to the adaptation of the term in character. Again, one camp insisted that the player's intelligence was based on the player. The other camp said, nope, it's based on the character. In one article, it was pointed out that if you ignore the intelligence of the character, then you were in fact playing a fantasy game and not a role-playing game. In fact, you'd adopted play that was purely mechanical, and the role-play was no longer relevant. And that the term role-playing implied that you adopted the role of the character, and if this is how you played, that's not what you were doing. Well, this arguably became one of the strongest arguments for that particular side of the argument. And by 1977, games began to imply that characters should have constraints on... that players should have constraints on their agency. And be dependent on the statistics of the character that were playing. For example, in Chivalry and Sorcery, they recommended if a character is stupid, roleplay them as stupid, and have them act stupid. In Starship and Spaceman in 1978, they wrote, it cannot be overstressed that the player of the game should play a role as determined by his character's actions. That is, the player should form a concept in his own mind as to what type of person his character is, and then act in accordance with these ideas. The character's type should obviously be based on his abilities, as determined by the dice rolls. Players should always try to act in character. While this may not prove advantageous in one's particular set of circumstances, it led to a much better game. overall. Now, we've all played the games where we look at our character sheet and think, I have a 7 intelligence. I, as a player, know blindly running into this room is a bad idea, but would that be knowledge that my character has? And now we have to make a choice.
Was a topic for a previous Dialogues and Dice many, many years ago. We talked about characteristics specifically.
Yep.
And how translating them, you know, I'm playing a barbarian who's really strong and fit. Well, look at me. I'm not strong and fit, but that's allowed. But then the intelligence, wisdom, charisma aspect comes in, and your comfort level with roleplay in general.
Right.
Really screwed the pooch in a way, because it's like, yeah, Seth Mildwood is a kind of average intelligence person. I like to think that I'm relatively smart. Every once in a while, I say smart things and think, well, Seth wouldn't say that. What was I thinking?
Right.
Like, I trip myself. Likewise, playing a genius wizard character, or a sailor. I don't know how to sail. Now I'm expected to know nautical terms, because in roleplay, my character does know nautical terms.
Right.
Really flips me off and messes me up.
Llama said it's easier to play dumb if you're smart as compared to playing smart if you're dumb. In theory,
you think so.
In theory, but sometimes very smart people overestimate how dumb other people are.
That's true too. Right.
Really, it's a challenge either way. But that's literally where I was going to segue over to you and say, think about the characters that you've played.
Yeah.
And when you've been in that situation. Physical statistics are easy to play.
Sure.
They never come into actual test.
Right.
Dexterity, strength. Those statistics doesn't matter because you're around a table. Yeah. But intelligence, wisdom, charisma, those stats kind of require the player to either step up or step down.
Yeah, that particular issue, when we talked about it last, it specifically revolved around the puzzles that you were putting on for how we roll, because you specifically said the puzzles are for the players, not the characters, but your character's intelligence will determine the hints you may or may not receive, right? Like, you're given a time limit with some opportunity for good hints because your character's smarter than you, especially during puzzles. But that was like one of the big challenges, was us on How We Roll learning what worked and what didn't for the show. Because yes, you gave us puzzles, but the pressure of performing made us dumber than we might have otherwise been with the puzzles. Right. So we felt like we weren't role-playing properly in a weird way, because we felt stupid staring at a puzzle in the face, not understanding what to do.
And that was a huge learning curve for me. One of the things that made me realize fundamentally how playing Dungeons & Dragons on a live stream is different than around a tabletop.
I mean, it evolved to that because we were doing it live.
Yeah, because around a tabletop, you can take a break, you can all discuss things, this, that, and the other, and you don't have a bunch of people watching you fail. Which, as you just said, kind of brings in a different element of stress, right?
But yeah, I mean, those other characteristics, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, they're such a strange thing to encapsulate when you're differentiating between character and player, because they are kind of entwined. Because yes, you're right. I know going toe-to-toe with a ghoul has a chance of getting me paralyzed and thusly killed. But then the question is a character smart enough or had experience with it in the past, with the wisdom, to know not to get toe-to-toe, even though the player does? And then how do you solve that problem?
Right.
Because you're right, with the physical characteristics, it's easy to solve. Hey, you're this strong, you're this dexterous, you can jump this far because the rules say you can do a running jump. But you can't do that with intellect and wisdom necessarily. And charisma is like, are you comfortable role-playing in front of people? You can play the most charismatic person in the world, but you as a player is shy as hell.
Right.
You're just sitting there like all introverted, and that's not the character, that's you. But
and I think that's one of the charms about the invention of role-playing games. And once people started to understand what that meant, and the fact that you were actually playing a role that wasn't you, it gave people agency to behave in a way that they wouldn't normally behave.
Sure, absolutely.
So I think that that's one of those things that really stood out as why a lot of people were drawn to this particular game. Now, again, like here on the right below me, you can see the rules for old school D&D, and then on to basic D&D. Well, at this time, we still did not have a consensus on how to play Dungeons and Dragons. Because again, we still had charts, tables, basic information on how to roll up characters, but at no point has anybody really said in any of these books, here's how you play this game. But I digress. So talking about players and basing on their abilities. So this led to people realizing if the player must abide by the character's nature, even when they know it is disadvantageous, then it matters how a character comes to be unwise or clumsy, and how involved the player should be in shaping that determination. Now, prior to now, it was not common for people to write character backgrounds. No one gave a shit. No one cared. You began your adventure at the start of a dungeon, and you played forward. And where you come from, who you are, your personality, none of that mattered. But these rules and people triggering each other's curiosity and discussions in these fanzines began to create a shape of what was going to become the role-playing game. So in 1978, we moved on to advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This was, instead of having basic D&D, levels 1 to 3, in which you got a player's pamphlet, a dungeon master's pamphlet, a map or two, whatever. Now we had all the concise rules for players in one thick, hundreds of pages hardback. And the same for the dungeon master, and then all the monsters in another book. And ultimately, this spurned on many, many, many other hardback books. But in Dungeons and Dragons, they noted that its principal characters were meant to be exceptional. Each player character should be in some way above average compared to the normal person. Even if you had some poor stats that made you stupid, clumsy, or weak, they should also have a stat that was higher than the norm. Once again, it fell onto the players to justify how and why these stats were what they were. Furthermore, D&D never specified any ultimate objective of its play. It was more about progression than winning. It noted a method of how characters could advance in power, and how this occurred episodically over many game sessions. The wargame term of campaign was then adopted to denote an overall span, but the term adventure replaced the term of battle for individual episodes. So around the War Games table, you played a campaign, and a campaign was made up of a number of battles. Now, here in Dungeons and Dragons, we're playing a campaign, but it is made up of a number of adventures. Characters gained experience during their campaign and continued to grow in power or retire or meet their untimely end. The things done during the adventure led to the earning of experience points, and this was a measure of the actual experiences a character had and therefore ultimately learned from.
Now, so at this early part of the changes that are happening, experience points are given specifically for combat encounters that you are victorious in.
And treasure.
Not other, and treasure. Okay,
Correct.
And treasure as well.
So,
but not other things, like
correct.
Circumventing a combat encounter.
Correct. There was no role-playing rewards.
Yeah, right.
In fact, Dungeons and Dragons experience points were handed out very differently. First of all, and again, at the basic level and the advanced level, individual characters had very different expectations. A thief, which was considered to be underpowered, only needed 1,250 experience points to get to level 2. A fighter needed 2,000. A wizard needed 2,500. This was in part to the understanding that some of these characters become ungodly powerful at high level. Therefore, they should have to work harder to get there.
Which has permeated the space ever since, because when you talk to anybody talking about class tier lists, wizards are the strongest, fighters drop off.
Right.
I mean, it just became part of the norm, I guess.
That's it. But how it worked was, based on your level, a monster would be worth a certain amount of experience points if killed. But how it would be, so for example, an orc may say 30 EXP/1 EH. Nobody knew what that meant. It was never explained. Nobody had a clue. However, eventually in a zine, one of Gary Gygax's old guard, I forget whether it was Tim Cass or Frank Mentzer, said, well, that means you get this many experience points for killing the monster, and this many for every hit point of damage your character did.
Oh.
So, if a monster was worth 2,000 experience /20 HP, the group as a whole got 2,000 experience points, but individual characters got 20 EXP for each hit point of damage they did. Thus, the characters that did the most damage earned more experience points than the character that would sit back and do nothing. The player, in turn, that tried to survive and keep his character out of harm's way would not be rewarded as much as the character that threw himself into the fray. And this was an understanding of concept. Also, a gold piece equaled an experience point. If you earned 500 gold pieces, you got 500 experience points.
It's so stupid.
Individual magical items had a gold piece value, thus an experience point value for acquiring them. So the concept of experience at that time was a little different than we understand it today. While this was all well and good, players, once they started realizing, it matters to me why my character is quick. It matters to me why my character is strong. It matters to me while I'm dumb. That led to the creation of backstory. People started to write backstories to explain this stuff. And as that happened, players began to have goals for their characters that were perhaps outside that of simply gaining power and experience points. Now, as these things occurred, the players become more and more invested in their character. The character was no longer just a number of words, a conglomeration of numbers and words on a sheet, but it started to become a detailed persona with likes and dislikes, a past, future goals, and it began to have relationships. This is where the term role-playing becomes solidified and became what we know it to be today. And that was the point in history, which was during Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, where role-playing really became a thing. Up until then, no one knew what it was. And people, as we said, played differently. But now, with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, it actually started to put in, now it had massive tomes with plenty of space for words. They started to explain more how to play the game and what role-playing was. What's up, Rainshine?
Hello.
So,
Yeah.
that's kind of where this evolution has gone. Now, the referee, now Dungeon Master, thus began to cater to this, and thus make considerations of this during the games they ran. Adventures began to favor the goals of the characters and would begin to create a more lifelike non-player, and they would begin to create more lifelike non-player characters for the players to have their characters converse with and interact with. This began to tap into the storytelling arts.
Okay. So before we continue,
Yep.
A couple days ago or several days ago, Junk Farmer sent me a TikTok, where a person was giving his hot take. And the hot take had everything to do, and Llama just touched upon it, with milestone leveling.
Yeah.
And where the guy on the TikTok was basically saying, employ experience-based leveling again, with the caveat that you do it with circumvention, roleplay, rewards, not just combat. And I responded to him saying, well, this is how we've always done it on How We Roll. It's not a hot take to me. I agree with it. I prefer not doing milestone leveling. I prefer the experience-based leveling. Which is just a funny concept that it's a hot take, that experience garnered leveling is such a controversial, not popular thing.
Right.
But I guess that makes sense considering alignments have also kind of gone out the window in D&D space. So things just changed, and the old guard is kind of going away to the new guard, which is new people with their own expectations or whatever.
Right. Well, and that's why I found this particular topic so interesting and wanted to talk about it, because as we started off, the evolution of how we went from a game which was purely combat related, nobody even understood what role-playing was. Then, even though it became a game, no one knew how to play it, and no one cared to know how to play it because you interpreted how you wanted to play it. But now things have truly altered and developed.
Right.
So with players now kind of tapping into these storytelling arcs, it began to become encouraged for referees / dungeon masters to begin to improve their own storytelling ability and start putting a stronger emphasis on creating a picture in the minds of the players. Now, in early day D&D, you might say something like, you open the door, and before you is a room. It is 30 by 30 square, with a 10-foot tall ceiling. It is made of stone. The room contains 2 chairs, a table, and at the table sits 2 orcs. Done. But now the emphasis is to elaborate on that description and the contents and paint a much more vivid vision, more so than just a tactical one.
Yeah, why are the orcs at the table? What are they doing?
Exactly. But nobody cared back in the day.
Yeah.
All you knew is I have a 30 by 30 room parameter. This defines my theater of war. And I have 2 orcs that are adversaries, and they are currently sitting, which gives me a tactical edge.
Right.
That was what you gleaned from that. And beyond that, you didn't care.
Right.
But now we care. Now it's changed.
We care. Yeah.
So, referees began to learn how to create immersion, suspense, and tension, and move play towards more towards storytelling than simple tactics. Now, this is where we began to move towards AD&D 2nd edition. So now we were no longer content to just have thick volumes of rules, but we wanted players to have options. We wanted to elaborate and give people a variety of different things that they could do. So while here below me you can see an example of the original core rulebooks, off of those we had these books: Player's Options, Skills and Powers, Player's Options, Combats and Tactics, Player's Option, Spells and Magic. And what these rules did was allow you to take any of the core character classes and mold them to be whatever you wanted them to be. If you wanted there were no multi-classing still, really, but if you wanted your fighter to be able to cast spells, these were the rules that allowed that to happen. Now, off of that, they also spawned what we called the Maroon Softback books, which was a softback book that was still a couple of 100 pages long, but we had one for elves, dwarves, halflings, fighters, clerics, every single class. We had them for Celtic campaigns, Viking campaigns, Norse campaigns. We had them for prehistoric campaigns. There were literally probably 50 of these supplemental books that gave you rules to interpret and modify your game.
So do you think that the Satanic Panic was less about not understanding what your kids were up to, and more about these kids are spending so much money on this shit, I gotta stop them from this behavior? I mean, that's a lot of handbooks. The barrier to entry seems very steep.
Right.
And there's an intimidation factor if you don't understand what's going on, right? Like,
well, and that's the thing, and it's like
it's funny.
I've just pulled up the AD&D rulebooks, and you notice on the Dungeon Master's Guide there's a picture of a huge red demon throttling a girl.
Sure. I mean, yes. I mean, I actually part of the paper.
So, as a parent that had no understanding of the game, you pick up a book, and that's what you see on the cover.
That's what you see on the cover. Yeah.
And then you hear the kids talking about fighting
I was
devils and
joking,
demons
but
and stuff.
Yeah.
So I feel like that was where it really came from. But that being said, I'm sure that there was a subculture of that was like, this is a ridiculously expensive game for our kids to play anyway, so we don't want them to play it.
Yeah, that's what I felt when I got into Magic in the 90s. My parents were like, you buying these card packs all the time, collecting these. And then, of course, it'd be different editions, not just Ice Age 4th edition, revised 2nd edition, Tempest. It's like too expensive, too much. But you're right. The demon on the cover probably didn't help. Although, if you were an evil secret society, I don't think you'd actually put a devil on your cover. You'd keep it hidden. You wouldn't want people to see it.
These were simpler times.
Just a leather-bound book.
Right.
Of
no, that's exactly it.
No. It's all funny to me.
No, it really is.
And damn you, Tom Hanks, yes.
There you go, damn you, Tom Hanks. But as the emphasis on story became more prevalent, right, so did the desire for favorable outcomes, because now we wanted a good story. So it was this that led to the acceptance at many tables for referees to fudge dice rolls in favor of a better story. Now, at the very beginning, remember we discussed how they determined that the intent should be that players shouldn't see the outcome of dice rolls because they shouldn't know what they cannot know. So this is why we have a DM screen. Well, now we're coming up with reasons why it's okay to roll those dice and then fucking ignore them and make your own decision. And while this isn't particularly something that's relevant, but that is an early terminology of the difference between D&D and what was called Iron Man D&D. Iron Man D&D was all dice rolls are rolled openly, so that there is no fudging of dice rolls for or against the player's favor. Whereas it was kind of accepted after a while, hey, if this makes the story better, it's okay for the DM to fudge these things. But it was through all of these developments that we've just discussed, all these changes, and the final that become the final consensus on how things should be for the tabletop role-playing game as we know it, and as it has now been developed. Now today, every table, although almost all will have some differences, are playing a very recognizable game. And if you play this game and come across another group in a store playing this game, you will instantly recognize it as such. But as we said, back in the early days, this was not the case. You could see a group of people playing D&D and they'd say, what are you doing? We're playing Dungeons & Dragons. No, you're not. That's not how you play this game. Yes, right. It is. But because there was no real consensus on how you played, it was the ultimate, nobody's fun is wrong, right?
Yeah.
So, as we always say, there's no wrong way to have fun, but there are some very defined concepts and ideologies that have always been meant to be consistent. Now, by now we've moved on to 3rd edition and 3.5 in the world. And at this time, we are still very much with that same Advanced Dungeons & Dragons ideology, but with less problematic and cumbersome rules. Yes, I said less cumbersome because AD&D was far more cumbersome than 3.5. If you think 3.5 is a difficult rule system, You have no understanding of what D&D used to be like.
I believe you, because 3.5 is slow and clunky and nonsensical in many ways, and frustrating too. Yet it is still my favorite of the D&D modes.
Well, that's it. It has its pros and cons, right?
Absolutely.
But beyond 3.5, we move to this edition, 5th edition. Now, today, there is far more of a focus on rules as written than there has ever been. And while there is nothing inherently wrong with that, it does go back to what was known to be true with such games even before D&D was born. And that is, you cannot possibly have a game with this many options and have rules that can accurately cover everything. Therefore, a referee, GM, or DM is expected to know when a rule is sound and fits, and when it is time to deviate from these rules to make up a new rule or modify the rule to fit the circumstance. We also see far more emphasis on the role-playing aspect of the game nowadays. There are some groups that don't even use dice anymore. They simply choose to narrate what happens. And conflict is dissolved almost like back in the day, which Shaggett's very familiar with, the mud.
Yes.
So, to touch on muds, and this is one of the biggest reasons why I have Shaggett here with us today as well. Right below me, you can see an image of what a mud used to look like. And in muds, there were no real mechanics that worked. They were more just agreed upon ways of doing things, right? You had numerics, you had stats, hit points.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't roll dice to see the outcome. You said what you did, and the other person role-played back at you. And a good mud player would know when to take hits, when to be hurt, when to lose. A poor mud player would never lose and would always parry every blow and always win the fight. I will confess, this is one area that Shagget has vastly more experience than me. So I would like to turn it over more to you and let you talk about muds.
Okay, so my introduction to muds came from AOL role-playing chat rooms. Now, that sounds worse than it is. Gord was having a good laugh about it before the show when we were kind of just summarizing what we would talk about tonight. I created a character who was a character in one of my books, or the books that the book I wrote, and I would go into an AOL chat room that literally was labeled a decrepit cathedral, and I'd enter with my sword roguish character, Seth Rainier. You know, Rainier sounds familiar, Seth, but okay. And I would meet this other guy who would be a gun-toting badass from World War II, and we would role-play, interacting with each other for the first time, sometimes fighting, sometimes becoming friends. And from that, I was introduced to a mud called Legends of Terrace. I've talked about this many times before. It was developed by a Brit guy, Mr. Gore, by the name of Paul Barnett. He is one of the designers of Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning, which came out in 2004, which was widely originally seen, or 2008, actually, not 2004, as a WoW killer. It was one of those WoW killer MMOs that came out that, of course, did not kill, that did not
kill
work.
WoW.
Legends of Terrace, Legends of Cosrin. There was another one like Legends of Achaea, which was not Tim, but it was, one of the first ones I joined. You're right. It was basically a interconnected chat rooms that did have skills and statistics and a field where you can describe your character, a dwarf, a monk, a seraphim, all the fucking things, the dragonkin, very D&D-esque. And you could level up your skills. You could go into different rooms and monsters would come in, and then you type in A1 or A2, and then your character would attack, or you would type C2 14, which would cast a certain spell at a certain level, and you would, in that game, fight fake text monsters, right? And that's how you level. And you'd also accept quests from NPCs in different rooms. Accept quests, read quests, show quests. Go to different places, pick up items, type in little commands to find items that are hidden, your little secret rooms or secret whatever. And your character would become stronger. And in my MUD, you could get to level 300. There was a roleplay element to it. PvP was discouraged. There was no mechanic for you to duel like in our chat room, where it would pit your character stats versus another character's stats and duel it out and come to a result. But of course, that didn't stop the roleplay storytelling people like myself who wanted to write stories and tell these stories in roleplay, and where you do personalized, customized emotes, where you literally type in EM, sits down at the table and cries because he lost his muffin. And then in the game, it would say, your character name sits down at the table and cries, and that's how you'd roleplay him. So of course, there was no mechanical way to PvP. But of course, if I'm a knight of the Temple of Light, and I'm versus a barbarian of the Temple of Death, we'd have a fight. We'd have to fight using those emotes. And of course, there's no way to mechanically resolve those fights. So, of course, people would power game, and people would never get hits, and they'd always parry, always block, always dodge, always find a way out of taking damage or losing. And it became a major point of frustration, because I wanted the stories to be kind of realistic and kind of all-encompassing. And sometimes you lose, sometimes you win, but you accept it as a storyteller that you're not perfect. Because, as I've always said, if that's how you want to role play, just write a book. Solve the problem. Don't involve other people and just power game and be super strong and invincible. Write a book where you're that, and hopefully people will like it and they'll find it interesting. Maybe they won't. So for a very, very, very long time, my character was a goody two-shoes character, and he always took a loss. He always took an L. I was the foil. I was the, hey, I would be approached behind the scenes in AOL or other chat rooms saying, I want to do a story where this happens, and I want you to be involved because I need a foil. I need someone to do it against. And for a very long time, I was just like, yeah, I'll be the yes man. I'll do it. And I would take the L. And after a while, I got really sick of it. And I said, I'm never losing again. I will give you what you give me. So I started role-playing that way with my character. Because by that time, I figured my character, who still was not level 300 at the point, he's only ever made it to like 136 or 138. Because I just role-played more than I did the questing or the grinding. I said, he's been through enough roleplay to be super powerful now, so fuck you. I'm not losing unless unless there's a good story there. It was a huge part of my life, off and on, for well over a decade. I joined in 1995 in AOL when it was a AOL client-side MUD, and then they went to a private, like personal clients. And I still pop in every once in a while, and people say, "Are you back? Are you coming back?" And there's only like 30 people in the world, by the way. And I say, "No, I'm just seeing what's up." And it was very informative. It was what helped me with my love for writing and storytelling. So it's only a natural evolution that when Gorbed said, "I want to do D&D online," after I watched him play Unturned and he watched me drunkenly draw, parties that I did on my stream, that How We Roll kind of came about. Because I was like, well, this is right up my alley. I love it. And I'm game. Teach me. And that's how I learned. And that's but mudding it's an interesting byproduct of this whole thing about tabletop and online. Because a lot of the times the role play and the mechanics of the game they don't have an intermediary. There's no way to interface the two. Each MUD kind of does it their own way, and you have to learn their way and make it work or not work based on your personal interests or what you want to do. So, sorry for rambling, but
no, that was the whole point. But
that was the whole point. Yeah,
the
it's really
relevance
funny.
There is, how emphasis on roleplay was kind of outside of actual game.
The actual game,
and how every MUD played totally different, even though technically they were all the same concept of a game.
They're the same kind of beast, yeah.
So, another observation that I have is that shortly after the initial success of Dungeons and Dragons, we saw an influx of new tabletop role-playing games that hit the market. Almost every IP you can think of, from Star Wars and Star Trek, and there below is a copy of the first edition Star Wars role-playing game, to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Ghostbusters. Every IP had a role-playing game. We had games for every possible genre: fantasy, sci-fi, superhero, post-apocalyptic, the real world, past, present, and future, horror, movie IPs, specific IPs that covered very narrow fields like the Wild West, etc. We also had, at that time, several generic systems like GURPS, which were just bare bones game systems for you to make your own game with. This lasted for many, many years, but eventually the market became so flooded, and a lot of the smaller publishers just could not keep going. Now, the larger ones, such as West End Games, White Wolf, Chaosium, and a few others, they all stayed afloat, but most of them disappeared. Now,
funny thing is, I used to play Ghostbusters and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles when I was a kid, and every time my mom wanted to play, I forced her to be April O'Neil. I was like, "Well, you're a girl, so you can't be a turtle," and my mom got really mad at me about that. So yeah,
that's funny. Now here we are with 5th edition, and we're about to. Well, basically, we are now in the next edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is very similar to 5th, but slightly different with some changes. And I'm going to try not to make this part too political, but I see this period in time that we just discussed re-emerging. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into speculating too much in the what, whens, and why for this is, other than to say, for very different reasons than before, we are seeing the re-emergence of other role-playing games in large quantities. Before, it was due to the growing popularity and customer base of the genre. People wanted more roleplay. They wanted more tabletop role-playing games. They were absorbing them at a terrific rate because they love D&D. Now they want more. But that was, as I said, all to do with an attitude of what was available. But it was still a continued desire to play tabletop role-playing games. Now, with this, we have seen games like other very popular games that have come and stuck around, like Call of Cthulhu. It was a popular game when Dungeons & Dragons was first out. It was one of the first big games to be successful by Chaosium. Another one, as we know, is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Another huge game. And we've seen these games become popular again. For a while, Call of Cthulhu, I want to say, got up to about the 4th edition and then kind of stayed there. But now we have a 5th and a 6th and even a 7th edition of Call of Cthulhu. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is very recently launched its 4th edition. So while these games were popular back in the day and kind of lost favor, they're coming back.
Also, like the Vampire Last Masquerade or whatever.
Yeah, Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse. These were all White Wolf games. Yeah. Wraith. But we're seeing them become popular again, and there is a flood of new and different systems heading back into the hobby. For example, we have Daggerheart from Darrican Press, which is the publishing arm of Critical Role. Raw Steel by MCDM. Morkborg by Freya Legan. Shadow Dark by the Arcane Library. And all of these are new games that are gaining a lot of traction. So the tabletop role-playing genre is more popular now than it has been for a very long time. And largely, this is in part due to the release of 5th edition and the custodianship of Wizards of the Coast. But while the resurgence of the genre is largely due to them, recent developments over the past couple of years have led for the cry for other options and the diversity of tabletop role-playing games once more. Now, the hobby to me is not Dungeons and Dragons, but tabletop role-playing games. And it is an exciting time, once again, to be in this hobby. My love for the IP, Dungeons and Dragons, runs deep. Many of my best memories from childhood till today, many of my friendships and relationships are all due to Dungeons and Dragons. All that being said, I have spent some time counting the number of different tabletop role-playing games I have played. And it is well over 100. I shit you not. From the well-known Call of Cthulhu, Star Wars, and Warhammer, to some really obscure stuff like this little game, Recon, which was basically it's a Vietnam-based role-playing game.
Wow.
Or Cyborg Commandos, which come out right after Terminator, the first Terminator movie.
Ah, okay.
Where you basically are a cybernetically enhanced individual fighting in a futuristic war.
Of course.
And I can say, with experience, that D&D has never been the best system, but it has always been the most popular. Now, I'm not here to discourage anyone from playing D&D, far from it. But I do want to encourage people to try other games, try other systems. Because not only are the systems different, but the feel is different. The enjoyment level is different. What you get from the games are very different. So, as we continue with how we roll, as you noticed, at one point it was Dungeons and Dragons, the same campaign, Monday nights and Thursday nights. Then it was 2 different campaigns, one on Monday, one on Thursday. And now it's D&D Mondays, a different system Thursdays. And on Thursdays we have played what, Shaggy? Star Wars?
West End Star Wars, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Paranoia, Cyberpunk,
Call of Cthulhu.
Fallout,
Almost. We almost
Shane,
played
don't
Fallout.
say anything, Shane. Shane, shut up. Don't
Almost
say
played
anything
Fallout.
in chat. I know what Shane's going to say. He's going to say, well, it's only one episode. Where's the rest? We know. But yes, we've done many different things. And honestly, and I've said this to Gore many
Cyborg
times.
Commandos was partly written by Gary Gygax Prepper. It was a Gygax. Again, this was after D&D.
But as I was saying, as I've said to Gore many times, I vastly prefer other games to D&D mechanically, and I've said that to you guys too. Like which ones I like a lot. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay being one of the biggest ones. It's my favorite system that I played yet, and I have not played hundreds like Gorbet has, but I have played. You've seen what I played.
You've played quite a few.
I've done everything I've done has been on High Reroll. Like, actually, all the game systems I've done.
Yep. And
you're gonna save it for the Q&A. Okay, Shane.
And off of that kind of back, and this is why tonight's kind of interesting, is when it comes to D&D, we don't know what we're going to do. I can say with almost certainty we are not going to progress past 5th edition. I don't think we're ever going to adopt the new version of D&D and play it. for two reasons. One, it's not that dissimilar, and two, I'm not spending all that money a second time. I'm just not doing it, and I don't encourage other people to do it. But with everything that's been happening with that particular IP, one of the most recent things being that Wizards of the Coast have entered into a merger with, not a merger, but a partnership with a gambling company to move Dungeons and Dragons into casino games and like video poker games and all this sort of stuff. It's very obvious that Wizards of the Coast is no longer particularly in control of anything, and Hasbro is control of all of it, and Hasbro care about money. And that is all they care about. And while in the past, TSR cared about money, but they had a passion for the game. Wizards of the Coast cared about money, but they had a passion for the game. I don't believe Hasbro has a passion for the game. I believe Hasbro sees it as yet another IP. So, with that being said, we have a lot of characters that still have a lot of stories to be told. So we're going to still play D&D. But I think you're going to start seeing us play more and more other games and other systems on Thursdays.
I think it's safe to say, because we have so many characters that we could return to or conclude, the odds of us doing a brand new D&D campaign with brand new characters is kind of not there, because there's much more we want to conclude and finish and give hopefully satisfactory endings to. Possibly not. But, I mean, there's the Evil campaign, there's the old flagship, there's the demigods we were playing. Those characters deserve a conclusion or their story to come to fruition however it results.
Right.
The odds of us saying, well, we're going to go to a new land with new characters and a new story.
If we do that, it probably won't be with Dungeons and Dragons. It will probably be with a different fantasy role-playing game, or with a different fantasy, or with a different game system, like the Chaosium role-play game system that we have tailor-made to how we roll.
Right.
We're not going to create our own from the ground up role-playing game and reinvent the wheel. We're not Critical Role. We don't have a publishing arm. That's not a thing that I want to go down. I don't have the resources to make it happen.
We're literally like 8 to 9 people in the cast, and that's it. We have nothing beyond the cast.
That doesn't mean that we may not sit down and take an existing game system and build a fantasy role-playing game and cherry pick the rules that we want and how it's going to work and pick the pieces and build a game out of that. It just won't be a whole from the ground up. I'm not saying that would never happen, but it's realistically never going to happen. When I was a kid, I wrote quite a few role-playing games. When I say a kid, a teenager. And they were all in composite notebooks. I did a Spy vs. Spy role-playing game. I did Airwolf, the role-playing game. Which ironically had a very limited story arc. Although at one point Airwolf did encounter Street Hawk, which was interesting. But yeah, we did some things. But there are a lot of good generic games out there. I like the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay system. It's very hard to break that system out of its environment because of how it's designed.
No.
But as I said, fortunately, there are things like the Chaosium system, the Cypher system, GURPS, all these other things that you can say, hey, let's use this system and create a game that we like based on the concepts that we like.
Yeah, there are some tabletop games that are really kind of married to the concept or IP. And as Gore said, it's kind of hard to break it apart or make it a separate thing. I feel that way with Cyberpunk. Like, that feels, you have to kind of be within Cyberpunk to make that make sense. You could technically do other things with it, but it feels really married to Night City. Like, if you're not in Night City in Cyberpunk, something's off, At least to me, because that's the entire point of Cyberpunk, is you're in one city and you're an edge runner and blah blah blah. As you said, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay or Warhammer Rogue Trader or whatever the 40k system is.
Right, that's right. Well, and like
it's
Modiphius,
kind of that way too. Yeah.
Modiphius that made Fallout. Modiphius uses basically a game system to make its own games, right? So
Right.
Star Trek and the Star Trek role-playing game by Modiphius and Fallout 3 by Modiphius are very similar because the system itself is the same, but they change certain rules to fit the genre.
Yeah.
So I, for one, could see taking the Call of Cthulhu game, which is based on the Chaosium role-playing game system, and taking Chaosium's role-playing game system and building a fantasy game out of that. Which would be, when instead of levels, it would all be skill-based. I think on how we roll, one of the types of systems we enjoy are skill-based systems. But we do enjoy playing games where they have micro advancements. I think we do enjoy playing games that allow for a diversity of character creation. And that's a system that leans very heavily into that. So that might be an option. But yeah, so I hope that kind of gave you guys a interesting dive into D&D, how it started, and quite honestly, how nobody knew how the fuck to play it to start with. Which I think is, and that's the biggest thing, is like nowadays, we all know how to play role-playing games because the rules tell us how. Or people show us how on social media. Or we go to a table and we learn. In lieu of any of those things existing, no one knew how.
I mean, even we got kind of a different taste of D&D with narrative D&D. I mean, back in the day, I mean, and you can watch that campaign, actually, the first Fallen campaign,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see that the rest of the table kind of changed how they role-played based on the narrative influence being introduced by Deistress. Because she played a particular way, and whereas prior to that campaign, I would say to Gorbed, I do this, I do that. You could actually hear us in that campaign say, my character does this. Like, we just changed the language because of the introduction of a new style, you know?
Right.
Which is interesting, and it's very subtle. You catch on to it if you watch those episodes kind of as they progress through the story, how the rest of us kind of changed how we played D&D because of that influence.
Right.
I mean, that was a surprise. I mean, you know, I watched streams of people doing narrative-based D&D where there is no DM. It's just people narrating what their character does in very lengthy, verbose ways, and then resolving their own actions, even, you know.
Without the use of dice.
I would just sit there. I mean, when I listen to it, it's just not my style personally.
Right.
But there's nothing wrong with it. As always, it's completely fine. It's just, does that speak to you as a style?
That's it.
And it's fascinating. But again, that just to me resonated as, just write a book already, guys. What are you doing?
Right.
Why are you being collaborative? Just write a book. But anyway.
No, absolutely. I mean, as we said,
it's very interesting.
Different styles, right?
Different styles.
But
different strokes
kind
for
of,
different
we're going to
folks.
segue into our next section, which is DM tips, but it's basically going to still be focused on this. It's tips based on what we've just discussed.
DM tips.
So if you've been here the entire episode, early on you heard us talking about how it was kind of intended from the get-go, whether it was properly articulated or not, it was intended that there were never any definitive rules for role-playing games. Because as we decided, or as we discussed, they all realized it was impossible to have enough rules to cover everything. And therefore, that was the reason you needed a referee / game master / dungeon master. Because if you could just play by a set of rules, you wouldn't need one. So what does that mean for you as a DM? Well, my tip is really this. Do not be afraid to alter rules as written to rules as intended or rules as desired, and be comfortable with changing rules when it does not fit your scenario. Now, if you're going to fundamentally change basic rules and you want to homebrew certain rules, please have the courtesy to tell your players up front at session 0, this is how I want to run. I.e., we're not going to use short rest or long rest rules the way the rules say. We're going to modify them because. And have that discussion. But when it comes down to rulings during play, if a circumstance arises and the rules say a thing, but it just doesn't make any sense that that is how it gets resolved, do not be frightened to say, yeah, fuck that. We're not going with that. That doesn't fit here. It doesn't make sense here. I tend to try very hard to make an emphasis on not metagaming as a DM. I personally believe the biggest metagamer at most tables is the Dungeon Master, not the players. Because a Dungeon Master has all of the knowledge of the players at his fingertips. So he can design an encounter that he knows the players can't deal with, right? He can optimize his combats to make it very difficult for players to succeed. Now, I'm not saying you should not use some of that, because of course the goal is to challenge your players. But you shouldn't lean in it so heavily that you yourself start metagaming. For example, if somebody hurls a fireball into a 10 by 10 room, the rules say you can make a reflex save to half that damage. A fireball is going to fill a 10 by 10 room, and unless there is a window or an open door or something for the NPC or monster to hide behind, I don't give them a saving throw.
Yeah.
You're taking the damage. There's no way you can... Your dexterity cannot save you in this scenario. There's nothing for you to dive behind. No window to jump out of.
I'm a rogue. I have it. I have the half. I only take quarter damage. What are you talking about?
So there are times when, as a DM, it's okay to say, yeah, this doesn't work here. Doesn't apply. You should never do it to victimize players. You should never do it to cheat the system. But if it just doesn't make sense, it's okay to say, yeah, not this time. And I think a good DM gets comfortable with that ability and with that notion that they're allowed to do that. You know, again, there is a line to be drawn. You know, just arbitrarily saying something like, yeah, your heal spell doesn't work. Why? It just doesn't. That's a dick move. Don't do that. But do you happen to be in a strange, underground, vile temple where a ritual has been done to deny gods the ability to assist their chosen champions? And because of that, all clerical spells in this particular instance are half effect? Okay. If it fits the story. Same with magic. If you have an area that might be magically void, you know, there's an area where magic just doesn't operate the same way or is diminished. But also understand that if you're going to play that card, at some point, maybe you should also play the card where magic is amplified a little bit. So that the players have a trust with you, so they know that even if you are changing the rules, you have a good reason. They understand that the reasoning is just and that the reasoning is fair. But being comfortable with changing those rules, using rules as intended, or exactly, Tara, the rule of cool, that's a thing. And it's intended to be a thing. And it has been intended to be a thing since the conception of this game.
Right.
As we said earlier, there is a much stronger player base right now that are clinging to rules as written. Partially, I believe that's because of the failure to properly interpret that meaning in the rulebooks at an early stage. and partly because the younger generation tends to be more combative and say, "That's not what it says." Blah 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 blah. It says blah blah. You know, we all hate a rules lawyer. And that brings us up to another potential topic in the future about what we'll do in Dialogues and Dice, which will be a discussion on pejorative terms and misconcepted terms.
So to piggyback off of the first tip you gave, from a player's perspective, my tip is simple. Talk to your DM. Talk to him or her, not just in session 0, outside too. They are passionate about the game. They love talking about it. They yap and yap. Fucking Gorbad yaps my ear off all the time with rules and stuff. But trust is implicit at a table, is necessary at a table, in such a way that if you don't talk to your dungeon master constantly about trivial things, big things, things you read, things you came across, you won't get that trust. Like, that won't come. And I think that's something that I feel is lacking. There's a lot of fear of the DM. I see and hear in a lot of forums and postings and Facebook and other things where players are objectively afraid to bring something to their dungeon master because they're afraid that they're going to get yelled at or, I mean, maybe that DM's just a dick, but usually you just get it over with and you settle something, and a rule or a change becomes clearer with that further conversation.
Right.
Gorbad can say at session 0, yeah, we're not doing short rest, long rest the same way because we're playing a fucked up story. We want it to be challenging. And the players, a lot of them are sheepish or first timers, will be like, yeah, okay, sir, yeah, we'll do that. And not quite understand why or the reasoning or the purpose behind it. And then the further conversation would kind of bring it into focus in such a way that then when something happens to your character, you don't get all pissy about it and feel like you were shortchanged or cheated. It fits the whole point of the campaign that Session 0 laid out, right? That was laid out to the entire party. I feel that is a big help for players to overcome that fear of the dungeon master. I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to get roasted by them. Well, that's not usually what happens. Usually it's just clarification occurs. Now, Gorbad roasts anyway, but I've known him for a decade, so I'm used to it. But he also knows me, then I do it. That's why I trust him when he screws over my characters. Or I screw over my character. I did that more than he did, to be fair. But I'm not afraid to like go there because I know that the story won't be compromised. It'll actually hopefully be elevated.
Right.
And a new kind of fun or challenge can happen to me. That was the big thing with my Emlyn character. The Warlock class in design for 5th edition in many ways is kind of boring. And when the opportunity presented itself for the story to take it where he dies and becomes an undead thing, Gorbad and I had a great conversation about the new rules, the new restrictions, what works, what doesn't work, the realities of being an undead thing that's decaying and bloated and it made the character more fun to me because I let it go there. I was like, sure, let's see where this takes it. And I think there's a lot of fear with players to have that happen to their characters, which I get, but you can still love your character just in a different way or a new way.
Yeah, and allow the player to have some agency in that because, like, Emlyn was basically killed by his own party. And you just kind of went along with it from the roleplay standpoint.
Yep.
And it was like, okay, well, you didn't lose your character. Your character wasn't killed. It was kind of taken away from you because of story. So, do you want a new character, or do we want to do something with this character?
No.
And it was like, okay, what about if, because this happened, now you are this powerful demon brings you back and says, okay, yeah, great, he's dead, but not as such. And how is that going to work? And we had our own private session 0 where we said, well, what are we going to say the rules for your new undead warlock are? How does that affect? Obviously, healing spells can't work on you anymore, but you have to have a way of healing, so here's how we can make that work. And clearly your personality is pretty much gone. You're a vile, evil husk of a thing. So certain emotional elements don't exist, but you still have cognitive and rational thought. But as you said, we had a big discussion, and we came away with it with a concept that worked for us at the table.
Yes.
And
it allowed me, when leveling up, to take things that were not core, but fit the story, and were then balanced around the story to make it not. I mean, especially if it was, like his ghostly visions. His ghost sight. One of his abilities is from one of the supplementals, I think. And I went to Gore and said, I want to take this because it fits my character. And he looked at it and said, this works, and it's not too broken, or doesn't, it still works. And I don't think that would have happened if I didn't have that innate trust or constant conversations for the years prior. I mean, the trust was there, built because I talked to him.
Yep.
And I talked to Ninja when I play with him on Fridays. I'm not afraid to talk to him. And I don't think any of the players are, actually. Yeah. But I have seen players show like a fear or a shyness, or they're reticent
not wanting to bring up stuff. Yeah,
they don't want to bring up stuff. They just kind of assume it's going to be, or or worse yet, a player bringing it to the table. This is how it is, and then the DM's like, "Wait, what?
The fuck
we didn't talk about this. Like, I didn't agree to this. You're just bringing it, and now it's canon. What are you doing?"
Yep.
So yeah.
Well, and like we said earlier, with the evolution of the concept of role-playing your character and having a backstory and goals and stuff that are not just tied to gaining levels, it's perfectly okay and should be encouraged, to go to a DM and say, hey, here's a thing my character wants to do. Here's a passion he has. Here's an achievement he'd like to work towards. DMs love that shit because it gives us something to build on. Gives us reasons to write things into story. We would rather write story that revolves around the characters than write story and then plop the characters in them and wait for the characters to make the story their own. If there's inherently the part of a story, you've seen it on How We Roll. Tolgar's tribe got wiped out. Now, it didn't, because when the Renscar tribe got virtually wiped out, Tolgar did not exist. But when Jane created the Barbarian, she said, hey, remember in the so-and-so campaign, there was that Red Scar Barbarian tribe and they were nearly all killed. Would it be cool if I was one of them? I was like, hell yeah, because that's leaning off of previous story. Love it. And then she said, well, one of the things I think that would drive my character is to try to rebuild that tribe and make it strong again. I was like, excellent, great idea. So that all become part of the story, not because it was my invention and desire. It was because Jane brought that to me and said, hey, here's a thing. Can we do this? I was like, hell yes. And then at one point she leans into Shagget and is like, hey, I want to manipulate you into going along with this. And Shagget's like, cool, because I want to manipulate you into basically being a meat shield for my violent. So the two characters, because the players had the agency, discussed it, and were happy to do it, built this symbiotic relationship that was organic, but both players were happy. It was forced on one player and against the other one's will and stuff like that. So as much as it's important to talk to the DM, I feel you need to talk to your fellow players.
Absolutely. I mean, 100%. And another quick example, Mindenbrook Sorrow. Asher, the Eldritch Knight in 5th edition. When I brought that concept to Gorbad, one of the first questions was, where would he fit in the pre-existing story we have already made? And we immediately fell to Iridian, the Kingsguard. Of course they'd be anti-magic Eldritch. They'd be the only Eldritch Knights, right? And then from that, I was like, well, where was my character during this campaign? And we found that segment where Marlowe cursed out a guard in Iridian. It was Shane, you probably remember this because you know more lore than I do. And I was like, what if that was my character that I'm playing now? When the character that Marlowe cursed out, who was not a named character, didn't exist before then, was just there. why not make him my character now? And that can become a part of the backstory. And that was a fun thing to do, to fit it in and make it make sense. And that only comes with communication with all parties involved. Yes, you're right. Talk to the DM, talk to players, have the players then talk to the DM. It's supposed to be collaborative. It's supposed to be.
It is. It's a collaborative
fleshed
game.
out in this way.
And that's why I just put in chat. You know, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If there is any one thing that I live by to what a DM's job is, it is the DM's job is to facilitate a great story for the players. And the word there is facilitate.
Right.
It is not. Part of that is to challenge the players. It is to challenge the characters. It is to create stand-up and win opportunities. It is to create tension. It is to create sorrow. It is create all these emotions, but ultimately it is to facilitate all of that happening and allowing the players the agency to explore that story. You know, we've said it before, there's a couple of things that are a little different when you're streaming Dungeons and Dragons and you want to have maps and battle maps for everything. We do not and again, going back to another Dialogues and Dice near you, where we talk about term misconceptions, but we don't railroad the players on how we roll. They are free to do whatever they want, go off in any tangent, do anything. However, there is an understanding that you do not get to change your mind between episodes. If at the end of an episode you determine on a course of action as a good player agency and there's a contract between the DM and the players are expected to continue to follow that path. And the reason for that is...
We're supposed to say what that path is to Gorbad, so he knows.
I have to make all the content for that.
Yeah.
If you tell me you're going to do a thing, and then at the very beginning of the very next stream do something completely different...
Which we have done twice
in the history
of How to Roll.
It causes issues. Now, both times it has happened...
Well, the first time was easier because it was a fake court, right?
Yeah.
And that was, you just threw a slapdash thing together.
Yep.
The second time was Miss of Cairnmore, where we were like, we're going to see the Lowlanders, and all of a sudden we're like, nah, fuck the Lowlanders. You know, that was really bad because you were kind of like, whoa, Jesus, what do I do now?
Right. Well,
that was a rough episode in some ways.
And part of that is I create some generic maps that I can just throw random encounters on to get to fill time if necessary. And like you said, in arguably one of the most fun episodes that we've ever done, which was 100% improv, was that fake court. Because, and it wasn't even that the players chose to do something that wasn't discussed. It was they chose a course of actions I did not foresee as a thing they might choose. So it was as much on me.
Right. That was a...
And it was awesome. I love that episode.
You know?
So we literally said, okay, well, we're going to take a short break. And while everybody else was at break, I built a map. Like 10 minutes. Trees here, grass here, ring of stones. I need these characters, need these NPCs, plop, 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 plop. Threw it all together. And then we played it, and it was excellent. Around a table, you can do that all day long. You can go off on any tangent. It doesn't matter.
No.
I can create it, and that's something I'm going to do probably on a Thursday in the near future, is we're going to build an adventure from the ground up with no preconceived notion. And we're going to literally build everything from an empty blank page and go through the concept of how to do that, just for fun. But to the case in point, around a table, I improvise shit all the time. I run adventures with no prep. No prep at all. And we have a setup for what we call Totem, Theater of the Mind. We actually have 2 sets of characters and a map to do that on. The issue is we originally had the idea that we could do it on nights where there's no D&D session, but then we realized it's kind of tough to get 4 or 5 people to set up and play that don't know that they're going to set up and play. So I'm not saying we won't do that, but what we'll probably have to do is do it a little bit more planned.
Yeah.
And have some theater of the mind, but kind of say, hey, if you want to play on this, here's when we're going to do it, and you need to go ahead and, we'll get you into the stream, make sure you've got a camera, make sure you got a mic, make sure you got a safe, sensible environment to stream from that's not full of chaos. And then we're going to hand you a couple of preset characters, start on a map at a particular town, and that's literally the prep that we'll have, and we will go from there and 100% wing everything that happens for the rest of the stream. So it will be theater of the mind, which means there won't be combat maps and stuff for this. It'll just be purely theater of the mind. But we have intentions of doing that. We had intentions of doing that a while ago. Just never got round to doing it.
Yeah, it's been like 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, we created 4 level 3 characters and 4 level 5 characters.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I did some of them on stream too.
We did. And we kept them low level just so that they'd be easy for people to pick up and play.
Yeah.
So,
I don't remember what most of them are, but I remember some of them are quite interesting.
Yep.
Conceptually.
Yeah, there's some fun ones. But yeah, so that as I said, to reiterate, that's my one big tip is do not be afraid to change the rules. Don't be afraid to alter things. Just if it's a major rule break, just discuss it with your players ahead of time. All right, last section, we're going to go into Q&A and let you guys ask us anything you want.
Also, to reiterate another
questions and answers.
Earlier, try different games. Try different game systems in tabletop.
Yeah.
Check them out.
Experiment. Go play Call of Cthulhu. Go play Warhammer. Go play...
They're worth playing. They're paranoia.
Yeah. Any of those games.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I know there's the role-playing game that you would really enjoy, Shagget, and we'll have to play it just for you.
Uh-oh.
Is the one that plays kind of like role player, like Rogue Trader, which is Dark Inquest.
Oh, I'm there.
Dark Inquest, where you're all like Inquisitors.
Fuck yeah.
For the Emperor.
I'm totally there, man.
It's an excellent game.
Yeah, Garbad knows this, and some of chat knows this. I've been on a 40k kick. I love Warhammer. I've fallen in love with it. I get... My YouTube algorithm recommends me shorts, like Warhammer shorts. What would happen if the Tyranids fought the orcs? What do the orcs think about other races? And I catch them piecemeal. I can't. Some of the longer lore videos, I'm just like, you're just too many names. But yeah, I'm enjoying it immensely. So
yep, it's
so yeah, I'm game. I would be totally down.
And
down to climb.
Cannot wait for Henry Cavill's 40k.
Whenever that comes out, yes.
Yeah, that will be a incredible thing, I'm sure.
Look, the God Emperor sucks, Neo, okay? It's all about Nurgle with me. I'm a Nurglite.
For the Emperor! But, yeah.
Dark Inquest, didn't we already do that campaign? Bane threw Shaggett's corpse down a cliff. True.
Yeah, it's, what is it called? Something Inquest. I don't think it's called Dark Inquest, it's something Inquest. But, yeah, it's a good game. Let's see, where's the, back up. Where's my 40k?
Yeah, give us questions.
Yeah, go ahead and throw some questions at us. And while that's happening, I'm going to find my 40k Space Marine soundtrack. Dark Heresy, that's it.
Shane said it. Yeah.
Dark Heresy, that's the one.
I would happily play Dark Heresy.
Yep. Space Marine, where are you?
I beat Rogue Trader playing a dogmatic character. Took me much longer than I was expecting because it's Owlcat. Apparently, they make very long games. Terra, just so you know, Magna Doom, the heretical character I created, is doing just fine. She's still in Act 1, but she's surviving. Yeah, Shane's a nerd.
Well, he fits in well here.
Neo Gambit, why did AD&D 2nd edition have weird strength modifiers for 18, 01 to 99, but no other stats did?
I can answer that. So, they did not. They had already predetermined that 20 plus stats were kind of taking you into godlike. But then they realized that with the addition of the barbarian character class and a few others, that there was a need to have a strength above 18, but not to be able to take it to the point where you become godlike. So what they did is they had the 18, or the basically 01 to 00. You stayed at 18, but it was kind of a the idea was like a diminishing return, right? So if you had 18 and you had 18/20 to 40, that was an extra +1 strength and damage modifier. And 40 to 60 was an additional +2, and 60 to 80, and then like up to 95, and then it was like 95 to 100 was like plus. So it gave them room within the system. Think of it like Warhammer. I mean, think of it like World of Warcraft when they had to do the number crunch, right? They kind of had set a parameter and then realized they hadn't given themselves enough room between here and here to play with, so they had to kind of do it in that way. So that's kind of how they did it.
Thor, any tools you recommend for a DM with zero artistic skill whatsoever to create world and town maps for Roll20?
Well, there's a couple of ways I use for coming up with just maps. A lot of the time I use Photoshop, but Incarnate is a really good tool. Incarnate will allow you to do good world maps and good region maps and towns and stuff like that. But there are a few others out there for designing dungeons and things, but if you want them for Roll20, quite honestly, the tools are kind of there if you know how to use them. I've done a few Roll20 demos in the past and kind of shown people how to get the most out of building a Roll20 map. If you've got interested, I'll do that again.
Beta, to answer, I have zero artistic skill. It is one of the barriers to my personal entry to dungeon mastering that is constantly turning me off of it, where I think, well, this is too much or I'm not good enough. The one and only time I DM'd a cyberpunk game for my real life friends and Sass and Jane, I bought the maps. I just found a map pack and I went to the store and I spent $20.
And there are a ton. Get on Reddit. And search. There are a ton of free resources out there. There are a lot of people that have done it. There are a lot of map makers that you can become a Patreon of. And if you pay like $1 to $5 for a month, you gain access to all the maps they've made, and they become downloadable. If you can afford to subscribe to those people and continue to pay month after month, I suggest you do so. But if you can't, a quick and easy way to get maps, go sub to them for a month, give them $5 because of all the time they put in, and download 30 or 40 maps for just a few dollars. But yeah, if it's something that you would like to see, I will do another how to build a map from the ground up in Roll20. Let's see. This might be a sensitive topic, though. Our thoughts on Hasbro and others using AI for stories and art. That's not sensitive to me because I have a very clear opinion on it. I believe that using AI-generated art for your own hobby, for your own enjoyment, for your own use, perfectly fine. We're not all artists. We don't all have the ability. It's a tool that allows us to achieve what we could not otherwise achieve. No issue. However, using it to create content for stuff you're going to sell, not a fan.
Nah.
I don't like that.
Same.
I feel like that's where you need to be valuing artists. That's what they're there for. Yeah. And the biggest reason I feel that is because most AI isn't really officially generated. It's kind of stolen imagery from all over the internet and then piecemealed together. So at some point, it's probably stolen somebody's work somewhere. And if you're going to sell it and make money with it, then I'm not a fan.
Yeah, it's akin to me about cheating in a single-player game. It's fine to do. If you want to cheat in your own single-player game, fine. The second you bring other people into it in a multiplayer format, it's not fine. Don't do it.
That's right.
You know, so it's like, yeah, do it for yourself.
You want to cheat in Skyrim, that's fine, but don't try to cheat in World of Warcraft.
Exactly. Yep. Right? So, yeah.
Yep. No, that's it. Yeah, I mean... But you know how it is. People are going to use these things. Yeah, I mean, indie startups, you know, again, you can get artists to do simplistic art for not incredible amounts of money. You're going to kickstart it, include enough Kickstarter dollars to pay some artists. Stretch gold doing better art. You know what I mean? And if it is truly generated AI, that's one thing, but you just have to be very careful to make sure that the art that you are using is genuinely artificially created, and not just something that was found on the internet because it fit your description.
Prepper, Dunno would be helpful in a virtual tabletop to generate a map for your specific requirements that the players take you outside of what you prepared. But that would still be for your table. And as long as you just be honest about it and say, hey, players, you threw a curveball at me, so I relied on this tool for this purpose. And the players, most players would be like, fine. But don't be that guy who says, and I put it on YouTube and made money off of it. Nah.
Or you know,
that's the difference.
Right, or you write an adventure and then you go and create a bunch of AI art and steal art and all that stuff, and then turn around, plug that art in, and try to palm it off as your own. I think that's another point, is if you're going to use it, you need to be upfront and claim that that's what it is. Tell people, this was created by, or this image was, you know, whatever. This is not my art. And I think that's one of those things. I mean, even like on How We Roll, there's two particular soundtracks I use for Curse of Strahd. One of them is written by a musician called Broadway. Another one is written by a musician called Savoy. I loved both those sets of audio so much. I wanted to use them for the stream. I went out, sent them emails, and got written permission from both of them back, and I let them know I am going to be streaming. I want to use your music for the stream. People do donate. There are some subscribers. We do put this on YouTube. Are you okay if I use your stuff? And in both cases, they wrote back very kind, very happy and polite letters that said, hey, absolutely, thank you for getting our stuff out there. And that is why at the video, the outro video that we play, it tells you this is we use their music. We give them credit. At no point does anybody claim that this is our music.
Right.
So I think that's okay. And to be honest, I found a lot of musicians and artists, if you ask them, you'd be amazed at how many of them will say, yeah, that's cool.
Now, there is a counterpoint to this, and that is the song that you could YouTube called Shag It Till You Drag It. I wrote that guy and said, can I use your music as my outro for my stream? And I didn't hear back from him.
Well, you know.
But then again, he is an old man, so he probably doesn't know anything about technology. But you could YouTube Shag It Till You Drag It, and I failed to procure that as my outro. Yeah. Which is why I don't stream ever again. I've not streamed ever since.
I'm not doing this anymore. But yeah. Anybody else got any suggestiones or questiones for us?
Shane did ask, is next Thursday going to have a show? Is there going to be a show on the 23rd?
It's not a special day or anything, is it?
No. What's the 23rd?
Probably.
January 23rd?
There probably will be a show. If it's not a story show, it may be another Dialogues and Dice, or I might do that Create an Adventure, or I might do a Roll20 tutorial. But there probably will be something.
Just something.
Yeah, there'll be something. Yep. Also, if anybody's got any ideas or interest in a Dialogues and Dice topic that we have not covered, feel free to email us or bring it up on a stream and say, hey, it would be cool if you did a Dialogues and Dice about XYZ.
All the Dialogues and Dice are on YouTube.
Yep.
Technically, there's a season 2, which is the more recent stuff. Maybe I'll put this under season 3. I mean, I'm sorry.
No, this is probably still season 2. It's the same overlay.
Still season 2?
Yeah.
Same overlay?
Yeah.
Okay.
But we used to do a Dialogues and Dice every Tuesday.
Yes.
Which
is
is
more
we had a Monday
specific.
show, a Tuesday show, and a Thursday show. It just got too much.
There's some really good ones, Beta.
Yeah.
The past Dialogues and Dice, especially when Gorbad would interview people within certain fields or his friends. Those were the best
There's
ones.
some
in my
great
opinion.
interviews, yeah.
Yeah. That
Yeah, we interviewed
That-
Ernie
that
Gygax Jr.
Renaissance woman was so cool.
Oh,
man.
Sky? Yeah, she's cool.
She was badass. And how she described how people actually fought in medieval armor with swords.
Yeah. So this
Totally
was
not shown in movies and stuff. Yeah.
If you haven't seen this one, it's basically a friend of mine that does HEMA, which is basically historic HEMA. What is it? Historic something or other medieval arts. It's basically medieval martial arts of fighting in armor with real weapons for real. Not padded weapons, actual broadswords, actual maces, actual and yeah, it was so interesting to hear from her. And she's a huge D&D player and leans into D&D, but like she said, from her perspective, it's bullshit.
Her perspective, my favorite point was when she said swings wildly, not a thing.
Yep.
That's not how they really fought. You would most likely be gripping the blade part, trying to scrape it and chinks and stuff.
Yeah, like
you would not be swinging.
Jamming the crossbar underneath the guy's chin.
Right? Like, because you're wearing a gauntlet metal hand. Of course you could grip the blade without cutting yourself.
And those swords weren't necessarily that sharp. They were huge
or that heavy.
Yeah.
That was the great swords are not as heavy as people would pretend they were. Yeah.
I mean,
really
and hearing
really cool.
hearing discussions about swords didn't scare you if you were in plate mail. A military pick scared you if you were in plate mail.
Pick.
A mace scared you if you were in plate mail.
Yeah.
We all lean into the concept of swords being the greatest weapon. And I remember there's another YouTube channel where similar people, in fact, I got it from her, talk about what were the best weapons. And by far the most definitive weapon from any period, and I'm not talking armor, specifically weapons, was the spear. And we don't think of spears as being very effective. But, like, spear versus longsword, spear won, like, 8 times out of 10.
I mean, it's so versatile, too. I mean, the way you can use it.
Right, exactly.
That's
and they're
what it's
so
all about.
wieldable and manageable. And like they said, it was so hard to get in on a spearman without getting skewered first.
Yeah.
Those sort of things. And you go back to, there used to be a show called Deadliest Warrior or something like that, where they would say samurai versus Viking, or after they'd done a bunch of them, they ended up categorizing them, and they said, okay, out of all of the sword and armor category, who was the baddest? Out of the gunpowder group, who was the baddest? Out of modern fighting, who was the baddest? I'll never forget that from the swords and armor, when you're talking samurais, ninjas, Vikings, gladiators, this, that, and the other, the Spartans came out top every time.
I do remember that.
And
yeah,
it was not because they were all built like brick shithouses. It was not because they could scream, "Oh!" at the top of their voice. It wasn't because of their... It was because they had a fucking great big bronze shield that nothing could get past.
Yeah, the most unrealistic part of the 300 movie was when, what's his name? Gerard Butler threw the spear and opted for the sword. Like, nah, he'd still have the spear the entire time. You keep that phalanx. And,
yep.
I did fall down a YouTube rabbit hole like a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, where a black belt in multiple martial arts, like a true Japanese master, was given a spear or a halberd for the first time. And so just what would you do with this if you were given this weapon on a battlefield? And it was him learning how to use it and what worked, what didn't. And that was the most interesting video I've ever seen. If you type in like black belt tries halberd, you will find it. It's not a very big YouTube video, but it's super informative because he goes through like, this is this style, this is that style. I would do this, and this is the weakness I see with the flipping or how I could get this angle. Very cool. And yeah, totally badass.
No, that's right. What was that? The doctor that we had with the red hair. She was cool. She was the one that used role-playing games and video games to help kids with learning disabilities and kids with Asperger's and were on the spectrum and stuff. She was fascinating. That was a real good interview. I don't remember her name, but I should. The real historic events are too grim for TV, right? Well, and again, like Sky said, real medieval combat's not fun to watch. Watching two people take a wild swing at each other and then rush forward and grab each other and then just wrestle, trying to poke each other with whatever sticky bit of the weapon that they happen to have is not cool.
Yeah, that was the video. How would a katana swordmaster fight with a halberd?
Cool.
That's the video I just put in. It's worth just looking at. It's the...
Excellent. I'll open it in a new tab and watch it later.
A friend of mine wants to play as a character with an eldritch background and tentacles. How would you as a DM go about homebrewing a character like that? There is a beta. There is a warlock subclass where you're basically like a sea tentacle warlock.
Yep.
I forget what it's called, but that is literally you spawn a tentacle that can at higher levels block some damage or reflect some damage, and it has that entire theme. You can play it like as a piratey sailor kind of character because the warlock, the entity is a sea kraken or whatever.
Yeah, I think you have to when creating anything like that. Kelly Dunlap, that's it, Neo. Thank you. You have to first have to look at the core base mechanics of the game, right? Which is number of attacks, action economy, what can be done in a round, what cannot be done, and acknowledge that you can or don't need to make anything and try to break those rules. So saying I've got 8 tentacles, therefore I get 8 extra attacks would not work. So you could basically say that the tentacles are not capable of manipulating weapons, right? However, you could say because you have these tentacles as a bonus action, you can attempt to grapple. And something like that. You could also say that if your tentacles have suckers on, you gain advantage when climbing or stuff like that. So you can think of ways that the tentacles can work within the rules and be interesting without conceptually breaking the core mechanics of the game. And those are the sort of things I would do. I would sit down and say, hey, what's your intent? Why do you want this? What are you hoping to achieve by doing this? And then taking that information and then trying to work within the confines of the system to apply it. And anytime something like that happens, the danger is accidentally creating something that's broken. Because you didn't realize how allowing a thing could lead to a thing. Because I'll guarantee you, any inventive player will always find a way to break something.
I mean, yeah, you could also flavor a monk. There is an astral self subclass.
Yep.
Where you basically imagine your key as an extension of yourself. So you develop another form. You could flavor it with tentacles and do that connection.
Yep.
And still keep within some kind of rules. Though that's also Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, by the way, that other class. The Fathomless Warlock and the Astral Self Monk. Same supplement. But yeah, so long as you make sure it's not broken and you talk to your DM and it's approved.
And that's really it. It's just making sure that it doesn't deviate and break the core rule. Not just because of the rules, but because of other players.
Yes.
You know, it's like you don't want to give a player something homebrewed that they can do something that no other character can, and it gives them an advantage or in any way feels like they're better, inherently better. Yeah, start with discussion or intent. Exactly. Yeah, no, and that's it. I think, you know, anytime... And my other thing is exactly what Shaggy just said. Anytime somebody wants to do something different, the first thing is to ask, can this be done with something that already exists? I want a fighter that doesn't wear armor and just uses a rapier and swings on ropes and is basically Errol Finn. Okay, we can do that with a fighter. We don't need a new class. You know.
Just not at my personal table, but you could do it. Just elsewhere. I don't want a naked rapier swinger Tarzan wannabe.
No, that's right. I mean,
do you, boo boo?
It's yeah, you know, it's just if it can't be done within the existing frame, ask should it be done.
Yeah.
And then if you still think that it is a viable thing, then just say, okay, we're going to make this, but we have to stay within the confines of what every other character is capable of doing.
And also, if there is a fear of the power scaling being different, have there be severe hindrances and weaknesses to offset the strengths that your homebrew could bring, right? You know,
exactly.
My Emlyn was an undead monstrosity. Healing potions don't work on him. He decomposes. He decays. He has no emotions. Those are big weaknesses.
But he didn't have to eat or drink and couldn't drown because he didn't breathe.
Right.
So he got some inherent bonuses, but the offsets for those were pretty. You know, it was like, hey, here's your list of advantages. Here's your list of disadvantages, and everything was kind of balanced out to where, as you said, it was like, this is functional, but it's not that cool.
Right, it's cool, but not that cool. It's like
and like, you know, the fact that you could heal yourself with claw attacks and stuff like that, much like doing like life tap.
But the offset to that is my character's not very strong, so his hit's not very high. So
and
you can't really do it in
put
combat.
Yourself at risk to kind of do that. So hence, when you went to farms and stuff, it was quite fun to watch Emlyn go chasing the piggies around.
Right, because
heal himself by butchering farm animals and stuff like that. Yeah.
I mean, I love that, and I also loved being outside tavern bars just looking in the
staring in the window, because what do I need to go in the
fuck.
tavern for? I don't give a shit that it's thundering and lightning and raining out here. It doesn't affect me. And they were like, we don't want you to come in here. You'll put everybody off. You smell bad. You're horrible. You're ugly.
And then glance out the window and there's my fucked up eyes staring at them, no emotion.
Yeah, it's like thundering and lightning, and as the lightning goes off, you catch a glimpse of this pallid face staring through the window. Yep. No, it
was fun.
Yeah, I mean, all the social drawbacks that the character had. You know, you couldn't just go up to somebody and talk to them. It was like they'd run screaming, or kill you, or try. Would you ever basically have a trial basis for these things and tell the player, yes, but if we need to make change? Oh, absolutely. Anytime you homebrew something, I feel it is imperative that you allow yourself the agency to change as is necessary. You know, after a few sessions, going back to the player and saying, hey, look, I know we said we were going to let your character do this, but in hindsight, that's a bit OP. We're going to scale that back. Absolutely do that.
What the what?
But again, what's up, Ninja? Just like we kind of said, comes back to that talking, right? Make sure that the player knows, hey, we're going to create this character for you to play, and here's what we've decided upon. But if this doesn't work and during play isn't balanced well, we're going to nerf it. We're going to make changes. And if they're not okay with that, then they probably shouldn't be given that level of agency at the table in the first place.
Yes.
So, this episode of Dialogues and Dice, it'll be on the VOD for Twitch for a few weeks if you've missed it. And, of course, it will ultimately end up on YouTube as well. So.
Yep, I will be downloading it and doing that after we finish.
There you go. Well, it's almost 10:30, so we're pretty much at the end. It's a long Dialogues and Dice.
Yeah.
Good, long, in-depth discussion and topic. So I hope it was interesting for everybody. I thought it was a interesting, kind of thing to examine and look at. And the fundamentals of the simple fact that nobody knew how to play D&D, even with rulebooks at one point, was, and following that evolution of how tabletop role-playing games become a thing, but before they were a thing, they were a different thing. And then they become a thing, but nobody was really sure what the thing was. And how we ultimately get to the thing that we have now. Oh yeah, wargames went way, way back. Before miniatures, they were just using like little squares or pieces of paper or little blocks of wood. So the Prussians were big into that.
Yeah.
But as I say, but they weren't just playing games. They were literally using it to train their lieutenants and generals to how to fight and conduct real battles and think about the outcomes. So, good stuff. All right, guys. Well, thanks for hanging out with us. We had fun. Are we here this Monday? No, we're not here Monday because it's MLK. Everybody's off. It's a holiday. But yeah, Thursday we should have a show. So we'll see you for that. Appreciate everybody that hung out. Thank you for our kind cheers. Thanks for our follows. Thanks for our subs and resubs. Most of all, thanks to every one of you that gave us your time. We truly appreciate it. Yeah, we'll see y'all again soon. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.